It's that time again, it's time for another Rust update. And with this edition, we now have card games. Well, a card game. As per usual, dependent on when you watch this, it's either A, on the staging branch if you're watching this before the April patch has been released, which I believe may be the 1st of April. And if you're watching this after the release, then it should be, well, in the live game. The new card game is poker, in the form of Texas Holdem. Now, for many of you, this may be a foreign concept, and for some of you, it's time to revel in your hours of watching late night poker shows or hustling on Facebook apps. Now, as this video doesn't have much in the way of an update, I'm going to explain the basics of Texas Holdem in a bid to help the less experienced players understand exactly what's going on. It's probably worth pointing out, I'm as far from entering a PokerStars tournament as I am from competing in the Tour de France. And by that, I mean I understand the basic concepts of Texas Holdem myself, but feel free to correct any mistakes I may make during this video, which I'm sure won't be uncommon. Right, so first things first, where can you play Texas Holdem, I hear you ask? Well, good sirs and madams, this can be found in the Pit of Despair along with all the other scrap-sucking activities in Rust. Obviously, I'm referring to the Bandit Camp. So currently there are 2 tables which you can play Texas Holdem at. These can be found either next to the recycler or between the slots and the Wheel of Fortune. You need a minimum of 2 players to start a game with a maximum of 6 in total, which is pretty obvious from the chair layout. To start, you first need to sit down and place some scrap in the stash bag in front of you. You will need what is commonly referred to as a buy-in to play, which is currently set at 100 scrap. This is common practice and the minimum amount of scrap needed before you can play a game. This is typically found in tournaments, so I was surprised to see it in Rust. There is also a maximum buy-in as well of 1000 scrap, but I'm pretty sure this won't be of concern to many of you. Once you have someone to play in and met the minimum scrap buy-in requirement, you can now start the game. Games of Texas Holdem have an initial compulsory bet. This is a value between 0 and 10 scrap, depending on what position you currently hold. Positions are shown on the left hand side of the screen, and this is either D, which is short for dealer, which requires no initial bet to show your hand, SB, which is short for small blind, which requires an initial bet of 5 scrap to show your hand, BB, which is short for big blind, which requires an initial bet of 10 scrap to show your hand, and finally everyone else, aka the last player if there is 4 people playing, won't have any identifying icon, but similar to the dealer also won't have any compulsory bet to show their hand. The order in which player goes first is dependent on the player position. Players to the left of the big blind go first. In the case of 4 players, that would be the standard player. In the case of 2 and 3 players, that would be the dealer. It's also worth noting in a 2-player game there is no big blind, but there is still a dealer and a small blind. With the game started, you're in the phase known as the pre-flop. This is where you and your opponents can choose to raise the stakes of the game before the flop occurs. I'll cover the flop and how it works in a second. Each player has a choice of 5 options and a timer of 30 seconds to decide their option. They can either call or check. If you're not the big blind or someone has raised the stakes, then you will have to call to continue playing, which basically means pay the outstanding 10 scrap to play the game. This is only 5 scrap if you're the small blind. Or pay what someone has raised the stakes to. And if you are the big blind or you have already called and no one else has raised, then you have the option to check, which means continue playing without having to pay any more scrap. Fold. This is a simple one, basically give up and lose any scrap you've already put down. Raise. This raises the current stake and forces any player preceding you to either call your new stake, raise again, or fold. All in. This basically forces all the other players to match your bet or fold. If you do go all in, then you can no longer play until the game has ended. Other players continue to play unless the stake exceeds their amount of scrap. Finally, dismount. You simply press and hold space to leave the table, thus ending the game for yourself and losing any scrap you've put down. The flop occurs when all players call and there are no more raises. This is where 3 cards are placed onto the board. This is preceded by the turn, when again all players call and a 4th card is dealt. And finally the river, when once again all players call and a 5th card is dealt. Between each of these phases you can still raise, call, fold and all in. In the poker game 5-card draw, which might be a little bit more familiar to you, players are given 5 cards and from those cards they make their hand. Now in 5-card draw they can change their hands, but in Texas Hold'em you cannot change your cards. Instead what you do is you make a hand from the cards you have and combine that with what's on the board. The board, as I've already stated, can have a total of 5 cards, so combine that with your 2 cards, you can now make a hand of 5 cards from the 7 available. In poker there is an order of priority. Now I won't go into all the nuances of all the hands, I'll just cover the basics. This is the winning priority from lowest to highest. The first one is the easiest one, high card, where the player with the highest card wins. If more than one player has the same highest card, then the second highest card is compared and so on until a winner is decided. Next we have a pair, where a player has a matching set of 2 cards, e.g. 2 kings. If 2 or more players have a pair, then the highest pair wins. If 2 players have the same pair, then it will fall back to the high card rule. Then we have 2 pairs. This is where a player has 2 sets of matching cards. If 2 or more players have 2 pairs, then the winner is the player with the highest pair. Then the second highest pair if they also match, and finally high card if they match as well. We also have 3 of a kind. This is where a player has 3 matching cards, again highest 3 of a kind wins and so forth, you get the idea. Now we move on to a straight. This is where a player has 5 cards in sequential order but suit doesn't make any difference. If 2 or more players have a straight, then the player with the highest ending card wins. It's worth noting that ace is treated as a low and a high card depending on its position. So for example, ace 2, 3, 4, 5, it's treated as low, and for 10, jack, queen, king, ace, it's high. Next we move on to the flush. This is where a player has 5 cards of the same suit. If 2 players have a flush, then the highest card wins. We also have what is known as a full house. This is where a player has 3 of a kind and a pair together. If 2 players have a full house, then it falls to the highest 3 of a kind and then the pair and so forth. 4 of a kind is where a player has 4 of the same card. If 2 players have 4 of a kind, then the highest wins. We now move on to straight flush. This is where a player has 5 cards of the same suit in sequential order. If 2 or more players have a straight flush, then the highest card wins. Finally, we have the royal flush. This leads off the straight flush where you can have 5 cards of the same suit, but this is 10, jack, queen, king, ace. Only one player can have this due to there only being 5 cards on the board and 3 of them are needed to make the royal flush. Now, poker isn't all about what cards you have, it's about how you play as well. For instance, you could have nothing and go all in. This may cause other players to either fold or call your bluff. Just remember they could be calling your bluff with the bluff themselves. And poker is essentially just a game of deception, so play to your strengths. And that wraps up the card update of Rust, and pretty much a tutorial on how to play poker. Now, if you made it this far into the video, I applaud your commitment and wish you all the luck in your gambling endeavours. I wouldn't be surprised if we slowly see the bandit camp turn into Vegas over the next few months. Now, I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, please hit that thumbs up. And if you're interested in any more of my content, please don't forget to subscribe.